My father was an engineer and I grew up surrounded by engineers. To be honest, I actually thought everybody grew up and picked what kind of engineer they wanted to be.
Growing up, even before high school, I was quite interested in math and I like building things.
I like chemistry, so I did chemical engineering. And of course, I didn't quite realize there that chemistry has nothing to do with chemical engineering.
In 1968, India didn't really have those many higher education institutions. I was fortunate enough to get into one of these.
My mother was my biggest champion. She had gotten married at the age of 14 and did not have a chance to pursue a career.
My thought was that after I graduate from IIT, I'll probably get a reasonably good job. So that was the only thing. There was I did not play with chemistry sets. I did not make home, radio sets. I did not think I was a whiz kid.
Engineers, ultimately, you are designing things. You're trying to build better systems that work for society.
KIAP, the Kanpur Indo-American program, turns scientists into practitioners, academics into diplomats, and engineers into revolutionaries. At the end of World War II, America positioned herself as the champion of the rapidly decolonizing free world. In October 1949, President Truman signed the International Technical Cooperation Act, marking a significant turn in American foreign policy toward engineering diplomacy. It aimed at curbing the influence of the communist Soviet Union in developing countries by offering them scientific and technical assistance. President John F. Kennedy expanded Truman's vision in 1961, establishing the USAID, the United States Agency for International Development. Kennedy sought a diplomatic opening to India through a USAID contract to support IIT Kanpur with MIT at its helm.
In Kanpur itself, KIAP, Kaya program, was a consortium of 9 American universities. Really the top universities, from this country, like besides MIT, Caltech, Princeton, Berkeley, etc.
The IITs were set up by Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru in the early 1950s to modernize India. He believed that engineers would reopen the window between India and the world through technology. But Nehru had publicly declared that India's foreign policy would not be dictated by the Cold War alliances of the American and Soviet blocs. Instead, he was keenly focused on steering India's industrialization through technological and scientific expertise with international assistance. Britain, Germany, and the Soviet Union supported the IITs in Delhi, Madras, and Bombay.
This was the period of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and that really played a big role in this because the Soviet Union, Soviet engineers were on the ground in Bombay, and so Americans really wanted Kanpur to be sort of a symbol of American technological prowess and technological might. MIT, I think, always had a global vision of itself. Its idea of using science and technology to build a nation, to develop industries, was really fundamental to MIT throughout its history.
Since the Second World War, when the radiation lab began to work with the US military, MIT had been closely associated with the United States government. Nehru had visited MIT in 1949, and when USAID offered the institute the Kanpur contract, MIT's President Julius Stratton sent Norman Dahl to India to advise him on whether or not to take this on.
The original director of IIT Kanpur, P.K. Kelkar, had this vision really of breaking out of older systems of engineering education, some that had come from the British, to really implement American ideas.
He thought it was such a great marriage between him and Kelkar, the director. Absolute meeting of minds. So he loved it, because that two of them together really built IIT Kanpur. What they wanted to do was to actually offer exactly the same curriculum that was being offered in MIT at that time. Right? So I'm actually a group of those students who got it 100% what was being done here. You know, exactly the same curriculum. The style of teaching, style of everything was so different in IIT Kanpur that most of us as students were just absolutely gaga. Says, what is this place? Laboratories and libraries were open 24 hours a day. And I still remember going to the library and asking the librarian, how many books can I take out and for how long? She says, you can take out as many books as you want.
What the IITs did was take what was good about all of these other partners that they had and try to make something that worked in the Indian context.
Students at Kanpur thrived in the rigorous academic environment modelled on MIT. Dahl and Kelkar ensured that this was a truly equal partnership that avoided intellectual imperialism. This was an extraordinary achievement. They insisted that the American visitors were full-time staff and faculty, but their role, from conception to execution, was entirely advisory. Indians held position of authority in decision-making, even as the Americans weighed in on curricular matters. The Americans took their families to India, sent their children to local schools, and helped build IIT Kanpur and its community, brick by brick, person by person.
I was being taught by such enthusiastic and young faculty members. These people really, really wanted to see India succeed. And they were true academics at heart. So when they met Indians, right, they met Indian students and Indian faculty, all they saw was these wide-eyed, kids who were just extremely interested. I mean, these guys were not there for money. I mean, they were there because they wanted to set up something which will survive them. And they succeeded beyond their dreams.
When I was at Stanford, one of my professors at Stanford in the Aero department was Professor Holt Ashley. He had been one of the people from MIT who had been at IIT Kanpur when it was first set up. We had wonderful chat about how it was an exciting time on starting a new school in a country that was very much developing at that time. And since then it's paid off, where he was always very happy to see an IIT graduate.
The establishment of the Computer Center at IIT Kanpur in 1963, and this was really something remarkable. So a computer was flown in from the United States to Kanpur, and it really became a center of education.
The KIAP program was nothing short of extraordinary, becoming the most successful and long-lasting collaboration between India and America at the height of the Cold War. This was a particularly remarkable achievement at a time when India had doubled down on its policy of non-alignment and pursued a socialist model of economic development, much to the consternation of American statesmen. For close to a decade, the KIAP revolutionaries deftly overcame these ideological battles. Even as Nehru's dream was realized, the lofty goals of the technological visionaries were put aside in 1971 as India and Pakistan went to war over the liberation of Bangladesh. American support for Pakistan, its Cold War ally, led to a US Senate vote to stop foreign aid appropriation to India. In retaliation, India stopped issuing visas to Americans and KIAP dissolved. But even as the Cold War chill asserted itself on Indo-American relations, MIT continued to be visible at IIT for long after.
People don't understand this fact that the American style of education, which is dominant in India now, really came out of KIAP. The Russian model, German model, all these models completely failed, primarily because there was no such involvement of the institution. There was no such involvement of the intellectuals from these places in setting up the program. They were set up much more bureaucratically.
Well, MIT has a very unique way of educating the students. So the students that come out of MIT are not only excellent in technology, but are also very practical. And so combination of innovating and applying that innovation to practical problems is what distinguishes MIT students.
There was a lot of stuff which happened in the MIT undergrad world which had happened to me in the IIT undergrad world. So I think we were very well-rounded and quite well-versed in a variety of things which a normal undergraduate here was not well-versed in. So I think that was a tremendous education, and at that time for very little money.
I think there were two things about my undergrad education that I really appreciated, which I realize now did have the MIT imprint and the MIT DNA in that. The first was that in the IITs, even though the major, the branch, you choose when you start. The first year we mostly spent doing the foundational classes, which were common across all the disciplines, sort of like the General Institute requirements at MIT. The second thing, and even more as having graduated, I appreciate, is in the IITs we had to do humanities classes. Even though it was an engineering program, and that's something that at MIT too is, all students have to do a certain number of humanities classes.
How do you solve engineering problems in an extremely resource-constrained environment? And that is something which IITs taught us. I was working on autonomous vehicle projects, and even giving one component was very hard. One thing I feel that has helped the most is the confidence it gives you to go to IITs and the network of friends who are also doing amazing things everywhere in the world.
The IITs had been set up as elite institutions not intended for mass education. Only 1/10 of those who applied got in, even in the KIAP years, and most of them were men.
In my class, there were 6 women and about 350 students. Oh, it was pretty rough. It was quite brutal, in fact.
It was the first time in my life when I was at IIT that I was the only girl in the class. None of the guys, no one would come and sit next to me. To be able to do just as well as a guy, I think, was much harder because there was no teamwork, there was no support. And then, when I reflect back at that time, it used to kind of infuriate me a little because the guys would get a cheap thrill out of taking the air out of our bike tires.
Most of the departments, including the one I went to, at that time there were no women faculty members at all. And all of the boys would, they lived in the hostel together. Everybody in that department would be in the same hostel. They all studied together. They had papers from the previous exams. They had everything. And you often missed it because you didn't understand exactly what that was about. So there were lots of things like that where you just, couldn't figure this out. You had to do it on your own. And then there was just the constant harassment and the constant, the condescension, this constant undermining of your own self-esteem.
This was 1972. IITs had already established themselves as top institutions in engineering within India and also gaining recognition outside of India. Even at that time, there were you have to take the national exam. It was a very, very competitive process. My background was such that neither of my parents went to university. They don't have a university degree. And unlike most of my classmates at IIT whom I met, who had the opportunity for significant coaching for IIT, I did not have any.
The competition to get into the IITs and succeed there was intense, unevenly brutal, and often invisible. Some held on to the hope of a well-paying job in India after graduating. Others dreamed of the chance to go overseas for further studies.
In 60s and 70s, IITs graduated a few students, maybe 1,000. They were doing a pretty good job in bringing the students up to speed on the state-of-the-art technologies. But we didn't have exposure to those technologies. When I graduated from IIT Chennai, I majored in electronics and computers, but I'd never seen a computer in my life before.
So at that time in India, the opportunities were far fewer than today. We had very good education at IIT, but research was not on the radar screen of any of the IITs at that time. Perhaps for all IITs, and especially IIT Madras, more than 80% of the graduates went for higher studies, and pretty much everybody came to the US.
Even as an undergraduate, I was working on Jugnu, which was India's first nanosatellite project, and Boeing's autonomous vehicle. And all these projects kind of inculcated a wish to do deep research. And US was one of the best places which has graduate research going on. So that was the big motivation. And not surprisingly, a lot of the graduates from my batch come to US for their PhDs.
The 1965 US Immigration and Naturalization Act opened up immigration and citizenship to Asians after nearly half a century. The act prioritized highly educated immigrants like the IITians, who were amongst the earliest to take advantage of the opening up of America. Many found a home at MIT.
My mother played a very pivotal role. I did have very good grades at IIT. I did very well. So she said, don't stop here, keep going. And if you're going to do a PhD, go to the US.
Certainly the sequence of people coming for their PhDs and graduate work to the US was helped along by the fact that the curricula was well understood in the 70s by American universities. And they knew that the quality of students they were getting were very good. And at that time, the economy wasn't doing so well. So, I worked there in Delhi for 2 or 3 years, then I worked in Bombay for a year. Then I said, okay, time to get a 1-year degree somewhere where I can really learn something different from what I've already learned. And MIT was offering a technology and policy program degree, which I thought was quite interesting and exciting. So I thought, let's see if I can get in there.
So I was the first woman in the nearly 100-year history of my department to get a PhD. And when I first got into the program, which I was also the first woman, there was a lot of interest in it. And I was also one of the first people to do it in 1 semester, which was, to get into the program, to make it through the qualifiers. And for some reason, that fact got lost in the fact, in the fact that I was the first woman.
I had my PhD thesis defense a year and 8 months into my PhD. And so I was really thrilled. I may still hold the record for the fastest PhD in engineering at MIT from start to finish. But probably I was the first Asia-born to be dean of any of the schools at MIT at that time. 140 years after MIT was founded, when the first Indian student to MIT came in the early 1900s. So it took a long time for Asians to have leadership roles, even in institutions that are highly international and cosmopolitan like MIT.
Before me, there is nobody from IIT in MIT, right? And after me, there is nobody who's not from IIT.
The IITs were Nehru's dream to industrialize and modernize India. And from that dream bloomed thousands of other dreams. The audacious aspirations of the KIAP visionaries not only created a revolution on the Ganga, but revolutionized technology and enterprise across the globe as IITians made their way to America.
In the 90s and 2000s, because the people who had come outside of India and proven themselves in US some of us became the best brand ambassadors for India in US.
I think the human experience and the things that you learn from either history or literature and the emotional side of things is really a large part of being able to build better products or better systems that ultimately can make people's lives better, right?
IITs are looked at as absolutely the jewel in their student body. And it shows. I mean, it shows everywhere. It shows in the faculty appointments all over the country. It shows in the National Academy of Engineering, National Academy of Sciences, that how well these people have done, and so on. So I think we were trained well, and then we performed. So everybody won.